So that concludes our analysis of the monetarist approach, the monetarist version of this model of ADAS. And with that, we can now move on to the second version, the Keynesian version of this model of ADAS. Now, this Keynesian approach was developed by John Maynard Keynes, a British economist. But before I explain the details of what Keynes had to say and what was his view of the macroeconomy and what was his version of this model of ADAS, let me first of all tell you that Keynes agreed with a lot of things that these monetarists had to say about the macroeconomy. And in large parts, Keynes agreed with this graphical depiction of the monetarists. So for instance, Keynes, he agreed with the monetarists in terms of whatever they had to say about this aggregate demand, its four components, and the way this aggregate demand may shift. Keynes agreed with all of those things. Keynes also agreed with the basic conceptual framework of these monetarists in terms of how it's the intersection of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply that determines the country's GDP and price level. Keynes agreed with all of that. Keynes even agreed that this potential output is extremely important, and Keynes agreed that in the long term, ultimately the goal of the countries should be to try and increase their potential output, to try and increase their productive capacity. What Keynes disagreed with was this monetarist suggestion that we can just simply ignore the short-run business cycles. Because what Keynes said was that, look, try to increase the potential output, but don't ignore these business cycles. And the reason Keynes said was that once your economy goes into, let's say, a deflationary gap such as this point E2 and its GDP dips below its potential, Keynes claimed that you will not automatically always self-correct. If you are in a deflationary gap, unlike the monetarists, Keynes said that the self-correction will not take place and your economy will not automatically come back to its potential. That is, Keynes did not believe in this power of the economy to self-correct. Now, to understand the Keynesian view and to make it much more easy to see what Keynes has to offer and why he was making all these suggestions, it is really very helpful to be aware of the simple fact that Keynes, he was looking at this model and he was talking about all of these things in the 1930s, which was the period of the Great Depression. Great Depression being one of the worst recessions that the world has ever seen. So what happened was that in 1929, the US stock market collapsed. And that started panic in the US economy, which was followed by a collapse of some of the major US investment banks, which was then followed by bankruptcies of some of the major global commercial banks. And that created a worldwide panic where households were too scared, they started losing their jobs, so consumption expenditure fell, and firms were scared, so they stopped investing, so investment component of aggregate demand also disappeared overnight. And since this was a global recession, so international trade sort of just disappeared, and therefore the net export component of countries' aggregate demand fell overnight. And all it means in terms of this model here is that if you assume that, let's say, the US or UK economy, let's assume, was sitting at this nice equilibrium of E1, producing its potential output in 1929. Then as the stock market crashed, as the banks started collapsing, and as this aggregate demand disappeared because of this panic and fear in the economies, then these countries' aggregate demand, it shifted to the left, and these economies moved to an equilibrium like E2, where they opened up a deflationary gap, their GDP fell below their potential GDP, and there was massive unemployment and there was massive economic hardship. Now, the monetarists of the time, during 1929, just sat there and told everybody that, look, you don't need to worry, you don't need to panic. Yes, we know there is a recession, yes, we know there is unemployment and economic pain, but these monetarists, they said that you simply need to wait for the long run to arrive. And they said that, look, once wages start to adjust and once wages get unstuck, once the long run arrives, then wages will fall in line with these earlier fallen price levels. The wages will fall in line with this massive unemployment in the country. People will eventually start settling in for lower wages for any type of a job. And therefore, monetarists said that when that happens, when wages fall, when long run arrives, the short run aggregate supply will start shifting to the right and your economy will move back to its potential. And this unemployment, you will get rid of it. Now this was 1929. And this long run of the monetarists, it did not arrive in 1930. It did not arrive in 1931. It did not arrive in 1932. Neither in 33, neither in 34. And this recession, this deflationary gap continued up until the late 1930s. And this is where finally Keynes stood up and he said that, look, if we keep on waiting for this imaginary long run of the monetarists to arrive, if we keep on waiting for the self-correction of the monetarists in the long run, then Keynes said that in that long run, we are all going to be dead. Basically meaning that Keynes was saying that, look, this long run, it does not exist, it will not arrive, and you will not automatically move back to your potential. So potential output is important, but Keynes said forget about this LRAS. You will not automatically always get back to your potential. You will not automatically always produce the potential output. If there is a deflationary gap, Keynes said that you could see it around yourself, that economies stay stuck in these deflationary gaps if you don't do anything about it. Now, the theoretical explanation Keynes gave as to why this long run of the monetarists is not arriving and why the self-correction is not going to take place, the way Keynes explained that was that, you see, Keynes said that anybody could see for themselves, they can look around that although there has been this massive unemployment, although people are finding it hard to get jobs, but Keynes said that you can see it around yourself that wages, they are not falling below a certain limit. That is, even though there is unemployment, that people, Keynes said, they won't just start working for free. So beyond a certain point, Keynes said that the wages won't fall anymore and they will be always stuck. And since wages are always sticky, therefore Keynes said that these deflationary gaps will persist. They will not self-correct. And the suggestion of Keynes was then very simple. He said that, look, this automatic self-correction is not going to come. So what do you need to do? Well, the whole problem has been created. It has started because the aggregate demand collapsed, and that's what threw your economies into this recession. So to get out of this recession, to get out of this deflationary gap, Keynes said that all you need to do as government is to try and push this aggregate demand, increase it, and therefore take the economy, force it to go back to its potential. So that is what we mean by active management of the macroeconomic short-run business cycles. And that is what Keynes was suggesting. Play around with your aggregate demand, manage your business cycles. Don't just wait for self-correction. It's not going to happen. Now, most of the monetarists of the day and the governments of that time and even the governments of today agree with these Keynesian ideas. So countries, in line with the suggestion of the Keynes, they try to manage the short-run business cycles and these short-run fluctuations around the country's potential by managing the country's aggregate demand, whereas they use supply-side policies, things that try to improve the quantity and quality of resources over the long term in order to, increase the country's potential output. So they do both the things. They try to increase the potential, but they also manage the business cycles through managing the country's aggregate demand. Now, the interesting thing is that this major disagreement of Keynes and all these major insights of Keynes that don't ignore the short-run business cycles, try to manage them through actively managing the country's aggregate demand. All of these key insights of Keynes can be explained very well just through this monetarist graphical version of this model. Keynes didn't need to come up with his own version of this ADAS to give or elaborate or explain these insights. Yet, Keynes did come up with his own version of this ADAS model. And the reason is that monetarists raise one last minor issue, to answer which Keynes had to come up with this weird-looking aggregate supply curve. Now, the issue that these monetarists raised was that, look, if you are in a deflationary gap such as E2, at this sort of an equilibrium, then monetarists said that, look, if you go for the Keynesian suggestion of pushing your aggregate demand, increasing it to get the country back to potential, monetarists said that fine, yes, you will go back to your potential, but if you look at the y-axis as you move from E2 to E1 by pushing your aggregate demand to the right, then that will create inflation. So this raised this question of, will an increase in aggregate demand, will that always cause inflation? Now Keynes said that according to this monetarist model, yes, you can see it for yourself that regardless of where you start, if aggregate demand increases, along the x-axis the GDP will increase, and along the y-axis the price levels will increase. According to this monetarist version, therefore, increase in aggregate demand will always cause inflation. But Keynes, he said that, look, it is not necessarily true that increase in aggregate demand will always cause inflation, but to express his point, he had to come up with his own version of this aggregate supply, which looks like this. Now, without going into a lot of detail, let me tell you what the main idea Keynes wanted to express through this weird looking aggregate supply curve. Now, Keynes said, again, reflecting his own times, the times of Great Depression, he said that currently the problem of our economies is that aggregate demand is too low, and therefore the equilibrium GDP that your countries are producing is much less than the country's potential output. Now, I will explain why this curve is vertical over here from this point onward, but just imagine that somewhere over here we have the country's potential output. So Keynesian aggregate supply is just saying that after your potential, you can't keep on increasing your GDP. So you have a straight vertical line just beyond your potential output. And then Keynes said that, like in those days of Great Depression, if the aggregate demand totally collapses, then that will open up a huge deflationary gap, meaning that since your economy is much below its potential, there would be a lot of spare excess capacity. There would be an underutilization of resources. And in this situation, starting from this particular equilibrium, if the aggregate demand increases to, let's say, AD2, Keynes said that these firms, they will be very happy to see these extra customers. They will immediately respond. They will produce more, so your GDP will increase, whereas your price levels will not increase that much, because there is so much excess capacity that as these firms start to increase production, their costs won't go up, so they won't, argue for more prices, higher prices. They would be happy to just serve these customers and see somebody coming to their shops to buy something. So if you are much below your potential output, and if there is a huge spare capacity in the economy, then Keynes said that increase in aggregate demand will not cause a lot of inflation. It will only, increase your country's GDP. Whereas Keynes said that if your economy is initially sitting somewhere close to its potential output, so let's call this AD3. So I'm just imagining different possible starting equilibria. So this pink aggregate demand 2 is where the Keynes is saying that, look, if your country is producing somewhere close to your potential, then there is not enough excess capacity. And this time, if the aggregate demand increases, then yes, the GDP will increase, but there will be significant amount of inflation. Now, the way Keynes explained this was that, look, if there is not enough capacity, then as firms try to respond to this increased aggregate demand and as they try to increase production, they will start hitting bottlenecks. Resources will become lesser and lesser, and therefore the price of resources, the cost of production will go up, and therefore the firms will ask for an increased price before they produce more. And then lastly, Keynes said that, look, if your economy is already sitting at its potential and then aggregate demand increases, then he said that, look, firms will try, but they won't be able to increase or produce more output. This increased aggregate demand, if you are already producing at your potential, it will just put pressure on the resources, and the result would be an increase in price levels, but GDP won't increase at all. So through this weird aggregate supply, all Keynes was trying to tell these monetarists was that if it is a deep recession where the economy has huge excess capacity and then aggregate demand increases, then only GDP will increase, inflation won't be an issue, price levels won't increase. Whereas if your economy is already sitting close to its potential and there is just a little bit of excess capacity, then if your aggregate demand increases, then GDP will increase, but price levels will also increase. So there would be both inflation as well as an increase in GDP. And the third situation is where your economy is already at its potential and then aggregate demand increases, then Keynes said, yes, the only result of increase in aggregate demand will be inflation. Now, what again Keynes was suggesting here through this model, if you think about it, is that he was saying that, playing around with aggregate demand, it is a good short-term policy to get over these business cycles where your economy falls below its potential. But this increase in aggregate demand, through this explanation, Keynes was saying, is not a long-term policy. Because once you have increased your aggregate demand enough to get to your potential, then just pushing your aggregate demand won't work. It would just cause inflation. So ultimately, Keynes said that yes, you have to increase your potential output so that your entire aggregate supply shifts to the right. And then, given the aggregate demand, whatever it is, your country's entire economy will expand and GDP will increase. So giving the same insight again, use or try to influence your aggregate demand to manage the short-run business cycles, but as a long-term policy, Keynes was saying, focus on your potential output, try to increase your country's productive capacity. So that sums up the Keynesian approach as well. And although this Keynesian version looks very different, but remember, the only additional insight it is giving us is this elaborate answer as to will an increase in aggregate demand always cause inflation. That is the only additional major insight that this weird-looking Keynesian version of this model gives us. Otherwise, as I have been trying to explain in this video, you can explain all of the Keynesian ideas using this monetarist version of this graph. On the other hand, it is also true that whatever we have learned about the macroeconomy through this monetarist version, we can express all of those same ideas using this weird-looking Keynesian aggregate supply. It's not that different. So what I will do now in the next video is that I will summarize this entire section and I will summarize everything that we have learned about the macroeconomy. And as I take you through that summary, I will put both this monetarist and the Keynesian version side by side, and I will tell you how you can easily use either of the two versions to express and elaborate all the things that we have learned about the macroeconomy.